Hello, everybody. It's a couple of weeks to the election, and looking at the headlines today, there's a certain what Umberto Eco used to call hyperreality to the world we seem to live in. On CNN, there's a picture of one of the presidential candidates working in McDonald's alongside the beginnings of a major war in the Middle East. It's hard to prioritize, and the Umberto Eco notion of hyperreality seems to be heightened in October 2024. One wonders what the future has in store, and certainly the element of hyperreality is playing out in nonfiction too. We're doing a show today with our favorite literary critic, Bethanne Patrick, book critic of the Los Angeles Times, as I've often joked on the show, and it's not really a joke, I think it's true, the best read woman in America. We're going to do two shows in October, one on new nonfiction books, one on fiction. We're going to begin with nonfiction, Bethanne. And I wonder whether this idea of hyperreality plays out in nonfiction. One of the books that perhaps we might begin with, Abbott Carla's Eden Undone. Abbott's actually been on our show before with her previous book. Seems to deal with the hyperreal nature of the world, except the difference with Carla's book is it was almost 100 years ago. So maybe hyperreality has always been around.
Well, that is so true, Andrew. It is great to be back. Glad to be here. And I do want to say one thing before I talk about Abbott Collar's really, really interesting book, which is that hyper reality and Umberto Eco. I experienced it once myself, drinking martinis with the great writer at 10 in the morning here in DC at the Jefferson Hotel.
I'm a hard person to make envious, but I am envious of that.
It was pretty great, let me tell you. One of those bucket list moments. But hyper reality is what it feels like right now, as you pointed out, with some of the things that are going on in our political arena, things that are going on geopolitically, etc. And Abbott's new book, Eden Undone, is about a very strange little utopia that formed on an island way, way down in the Pacific, the South Pacific, in the 1920s and 1930s. There are descendants of those would-be utopians still alive today. And it reminded me a lot of, there was a children's book years ago called The 21 Balloons about a place called Krakatoa and how people tried to make their ideal world. And this book reminded me so much of it. It is a fantastic read. And yet, as Abbott points out, Karen Abbott is the other, if you will, the real name of Abbott Collar. She writes under both names, and that is not a secret. But Abbott's note at the beginning tells you, look, everything in this book is true. There was a German psychiatrist or a doctor and his patient. There was a noblewoman and her pair of lovers. There was another pair, a married couple. There were all of these people.
Yeah, and the subtitle of the book, A True Story of Sex, Murder, and Utopia at the Dawn of World War II.
Yes.
In other words, sometimes you have stories and sometimes you have true stories. And as the cliche goes, Bethanne, you can't make this kind of stuff up.
You cannot make this kind of stuff up. This is a story of a murder that really hasn't been solved. And let me tell you, Collar kicks it at the end. The end. Any reader who goes to
You're not going to give the end away, I hope.
No, of course not. But it's a great read. I highly recommend that you pick it up for any time this fall. It is just terrific.
Yeah, it might take your mind off our current hyperreality.
There you go.
Another book which seems even more sort of perfectly suited to our is there such a word as our Econian moment? I'm not sure I'm making that one up.
I'm not sure if it's a real world word, but I'll go with the neologism.
Okay, well, our hyper real world is a book about the former Queen of England,
Yes.
Queen I grew up with, Queen Elizabeth II. It's by Craig Brown, A Voyage Around the Queen. But is it in itself, is it fair to call this a hyper-real treatment of Queen Elizabeth?
You know, Brown had previously given us 99 glimpses of Princess Margaret, and that was a much shorter book, which probably makes sense because of their impact on the world. But it was his way of putting together a biography in almost an autofiction kind of way. Of course, it's not his autobiography, but it's taking documents, anecdotes, newspaper articles, mashing them all together and giving us a look at these women who did grow up in, as you say, a kind of hyper reality. That is the only way, really, to describe the British monarchy in the 20th and 21st centuries. And something that I really appreciated about Q, A Voyage Around the Queen, because it's a little bit overblown, it's a little bit bottom heavy, kind of like the yacht that the royal yacht, I believe it was called Britannia.
I think it was was it Britannia or Balmoral? Anyway, yeah.
I can't remember, but before it was decommissioned, let's say, it was a little bottom heavy, and
We're
Brown
not going to
really.
make any jokes about bottom heavy royals, are we?
No, I'm not. But I am going to say that I think Brown, if I'm going to borrow a phrase from your countryman Simon Cowell, is a bit self-indulgent.
Oh,
However,
yeah. So you didn't care for the book?
no, I cared for it very much. It did get a little bit long. However, here's what I want to say about the book. Brown's best point and best understanding of the Queen is that she becomes a mirror for whomever meets her. She is almost a reflection. And
Yeah.
so many people become flustered in her presence. And I think it's because she understands that the real function of a monarch is not to have a personality, not to have an affect, but to simply be there as a symbol.
That's an
And
important point. And
yeah,
thinking about the current situation in the United States,
yes.
perhaps one of the presidential candidates himself, and that gives away who we're talking about, he recognizes that. I mean, America, of course, doesn't have a monarchy. But might it be fair to say, particularly in the context of the Brown piece about Queen Elizabeth, that Trump's running as a monarch or a wannabe monarch, and Harris, I almost forgot her name, is running as a prime minister?
Good heavens, you almost forgot Kamala Harris's name. Shame on you. But I would say that that is a pretty good metaphor for what's going on right now. I think Donald Trump is a man who would like to be king, and it's because he doesn't really understand what being a king entails. And Kamala Harris is running as a prime minister because a prime minister actually does the work of governing. And
Maybe they should run together. Maybe that's what
oh,
we need.
please, it's too close to the election, too close,
Yeah,
Andrew.
well, this is going to come out before the election, so
Yes, it's
everyone,
true. It's true, but it is a
we won't
very.
speculate. But certainly, the understanding this, it's not just the British obsession. I mean, one of the things about America, which is always so, again, hyper real or surreal to me,
Mhm.
is the American obsession with the Queen. Does Brown get into this? Why are the Americans so obsessed with the royal family?
He does get into it a bit, and he gets into it so that we can understand what it is that England cherishes so much about the Queen, or cherished, I should say, sadly. Um, one of the things we can't separate, I think, when we talk about Queen Elizabeth II, is that we cannot separate her long reign from her parents' decision to remain in London during the Blitz. That is something that has not been forgotten. There are still people alive who very much remember it. And it is what kept her so respected and admired, even through all of her terrible troubles, the annus horribilis, etc. But you have to remember, this is a woman who had a very powerful position, and yet there are ramifications of what happened in her life that really even affect us here in the United
Yeah.
States. The Epstein scandal. There was just a Saturday Night Live sketch last night that referenced Ghislaine Maxwell and Epstein. So, there are things that went on in the royal family that are still
Yeah,
affecting.
and in the context of her parents remaining in London, of course, it needs to be understood in the context also of her uncle's disgrace, his
Yes,
association with Nazi Germany, and all the rest of
yes.
it. Anyway, if America does have a royal institution, Bethanne, then of course it's the Supreme Court, where you get
Mhm.
appointed for life. And one of the authors on your list of nonfiction books for the fall this year is Ketanji Brown Jackson's new memoir,
Yes.
lovely one. I actually went to see Jackson speak in San Francisco recently, and I was astonished by the size of the crowd. There had to have been about 2,000 people there. She's obviously a remarkable woman, but
Yes.
is there shall we say, an American royal quality to Jackson? Do you think, as a person, perhaps?
I do think as a person, and this is why, uh, first of all, Lovely One isn't something she is anointing herself with. That is what.
Anything but. I mean, it's
No,
the reverse.
no, Ketanji that's what her name means, and I just think that is lovely in and of itself, that's what her parents chose as her name. She is a woman of remarkable courage, restraint, intelligence, and wit. One of
Mm.
the things I loved in this book is, some of the opinions. She'll even bring in something like a children's book, like If You Give a Mouse a Cookie, and it's always perfectly apt. I mean, this is a woman who is so well educated, so well read. She is exactly the kind of person that we all want on our Supreme Court. And we want more people like Justice Jackson on our Supreme Court. What I found interesting about this book is that so it's a book about gratitude. It's not a book about struggles. I mean, she does not neglect to talk
Yeah, it's
about.
not an American dream book, and she's not an
Yeah,
American dream. She
yeah,
doesn't present herself in an American dream narrative, which
yes,
certainly
exactly.
some people might, given her history.
No, she has a very, very clear vision of who she is, what she can do, what her position is, and I was very happy to read it. I haven't read the Connie Chung memoir yet, which I understand is extremely good, and I do look forward to it. But I read Lovely One and think that it is a terrific choice for anyone who cares about our highest court, and also any woman will appreciate
Yeah,
how.
I was really struck with her speech. She was
Oh, I'm so glad.
incredibly humble and smart and funny
Yes.
and all the rest of it. I haven't read the book, but she talked a lot in the speech about her daughter and her sort of half regret at throwing herself into the law, given that she has I don't know whether you would call her a learning disabled daughter, a daughter
Mhm,
certainly with some issues and
mhm.
struggles. Does that come up a lot in the book? Her relationship with her daughter and what has happened?
It doesn't come up a lot because this is a book in which she is trying to show you her entire self, and so much of that is about her work. I dare say that any woman who has children and reaches the kind of professional success that Justice Jackson has will have stories about this. Most women I know who are also mothers know that even if you devoted yourself 100% to a child with struggles, that doesn't mean that you can eliminate those struggles or fix them. It takes a village. And so I think she puts it in proper context, but it is very moving to hear from someone at her level that there are regrets because, I mean, the thing about regrets is we all have them. It's how we move forward that matters.
Yeah, we were just talking about our mutual children.
Yes.
Speaking of mothers, uh, I'm sorry for my loss, an urgent examination of reproductive care in America by two authors, Rebecca Little and Colleen Long. What do they tell us about parenting or the tragedy of parenting in America today?
Well, what they tell us is that we have got to bring all of this out in the open. One of the delimitations that they made is they decided we're not going to talk about, you know, late term
Yeah, and
abortions.
just to be clear, it's the subtitle of the book is An Urgent Examination of Reproductive Care in America. So this
Right.
is a
They wanted.
nonfiction book about the abortion issue in America.
Sorry, yes, exactly. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. They didn't want to talk about the extremes. They didn't want to talk about, infertility or, like I said, late term, abortions or terminations. They wanted to talk about the gray area. And I just said any woman who is also a mother understands that you have regrets when raising your children. Almost every woman I know who has children, and many women I know who don't, have experienced stillbirth, miscarriage, abortion, termination for medical reasons, ectopic pregnancies, all of these things. And there's a lot of grief and mourning that go along with all of them that complicates talking about them. And what matters to these authors is that when you don't talk about this stuff because you are holding things back out of grief or out of, respect for someone, then we don't decide what works. We don't decide what's really best for women in America in terms of reproductive rights. And so they want to say, look, I'm sorry for my loss. They both had stillbirths. They experienced those, which is really terrible. I know women who have experienced stillbirth. I know women who have gone through all of these things, including myself. I had a miscarriage years ago between my two full-term pregnancies and healthy children. And it really couldn't be talked about much at the time in the community where I was living. And people thought they were being kind, but all you want is acknowledgement when you experience a loss like that. You want someone to say, this is terrible. You want someone to say, no wonder you're having a hard time. You don't want people to say it's God's will or you'll have another baby or, pick yourself up and, just get on with it.
And I understand the politics here, but
Yeah.
I know this is an incredibly controversial subject in America. But is this political? I mean, I would guess that
No, it's
conservatives,
not.
Evangelical conservatives,
The book is
given
not
their what
political.
some people see as their fetish of life and birth, that
Yes.
they would be even more traumatized by stillborn children than progressives.
Well, this is what Little and Long had decided. They did not write a political book. They want this to be a book that politicians will read and learn from, but they did not want to get into the politics. So this is not a book that has a screed in it or a specific message. It's a book about the real experiences of women who have gone through these difficult pregnancies and the other things around them. And they did a lot of interviews and they did control for things like, look, if someone's coming forward and telling their story, then there's a certain bias there. Because, of course, for every woman who is willing to say, this happened to me, there is a woman, and believe me, I'm not a statistics maven, I'm just a book maven, but there's going to be a woman who is not sharing her story. So this cannot be a book that is comprehensive. It's simply a book that's very thoughtful and very much focused on the experience of reproduction.
Right, and
And
I think perhaps going back to the Ketanji
Mhm.
Jackson book, I mean, her joy of having a child can be read in juxtaposition, in contrast with the Little and Long book.
I think
Let's go
so.
back to American royalty. Another real American royal is Al Pacino. He has a new memoir out, Sonny Boy. I read a little bit of it in the Guardian, and I was really struck with not only how interesting, obviously, his life is, but how well he writes. Is this a well-written book? I thought it was really the
It's
bit I
very
read.
well written, but it is, he did write it with, and oh, I'm sorry, I should have brought this along with me. It's a well-known writer who is his ghostwriter.
Well, no,
However,
it's not. It's what is it with ghostwriters, Bethanne? Should they always be mentioned? I mean, if Pacino didn't really write this, shouldn't it be by Al Pacino and X?
I think it should be. I think it's high time we acknowledged the ghostwriters. But here's the thing, and I'll be really quick about this, Andrew. You know, there's a ghostwriter who sometimes is mentioned, as in the case of Prince Harry and J.R. Moehringer for Spare. Sometimes ghostwriters don't want to be mentioned, or the person doesn't want the ghostwriter mentioned. Now, I have seen it's oh shoot, we'll have to look it up and put it in the show notes. But in this case, it's not on the cover. And I was going to say, the thing is, there are also collaborators. So sometimes now you will find that two people work on a book together and they will both have their names on it. The way, for instance, James Patterson works with various writers,
Yeah,
including,
I've seen that. But
you've seen
sometimes
that,
when
but
you interview the notable person, they don't want to talk about the other person.
no.
Anyway,
However,
let's
I
get
want
to
to
the
say,
heart of the matter.
yeah, what I
Pacino
want to
and
say about
the
Al
bit I
Pacino.
read in the Guardian, which I think has been making news in its own right, is the story about being hired by Coppola for the Godfather. This was a remarkable story. How he almost got fired, and how
Yes,
nervous he was, and in a sense, he might have even been pleased had he been fired.
he really would have been pleased in some ways. But I also want to say, before I forget, we were talking about reproduction and motherhood, and Al Pacino
Yeah,
has
84 years old, quite an
84
achievement.
years old, has a new child born last year.
Yeah.
And so that is an interesting thing to see him. He says this is something that is giving him life. What Sonny Boy will show you is what a life he's had. He has had a truly American life, coming up from the South Bronx and walking along the streets of Manhattan, reciting Shakespeare, really working on his craft. He is not someone who is a fly by night at all. He is really
Put it
interesting.
mildly, yeah.
Yeah, he's hot-headed. There are, things he regrets, talking about regrets again. But, and this goes back to what you said about enjoying that excerpt, I think that his voice comes through beautifully on every page. And that is not, it's not an accident. That's really great ghostwriting when you bring that spirit, that cadence, someone's diction through like that. This really is Al Pacino talking to you. It's
Yeah, one
remarkably.
of the stories, and maybe this sort of
Mhm.
touches again on the relationship between nonfiction and fiction. After Godfather came out, the first Godfather, Pacino said he was in New York and he was waiting at a traffic light and he was about to cross, and
Yeah.
a young, attractive woman came up to him and said, "Hello, Michael." Of course, Michael Corleone
Well, yeah,
still
yes.
remains his most famous representation, perhaps amongst the most celebrated figures in the whole history of American cinema. As an actor, uh, Bethanne, again, the cliche is that actors don't have selves; they simply are somebody else. Does Pacino get into this? Did he ever feel as if he was Michael Corleone or some of the other remarkable characters he represented? In a sense, they're all perhaps maybe he turned the whole cliche on its head. They all became versions of Al Pacino.
You know, that is probably one of the most pithy things I've heard about Al Pacino. I do think that his greatest roles, including From Scent of a Woman and all of his other movies, and why can't Scarface, that's what I was trying to think of.
Yeah.
When you think of Scarface, which is an amazing movie. It took me years to watch it. I thought I was going to be really turned off by the violence. And instead, I was mesmerized by what he did with that character. And how do you think of Scarface or Michael Corleone or anything that he's been in without thinking of Al Pacino? So I agree with you about that. And I do agree with you also that he melted in and out of those characters, and his ways of getting into a character are part of what makes this an amazing book. Now, what makes it less amazing is the way you see he treats the women in his life. It's terrible all the way through. He is someone, and without getting into a lot of gender politics.
And this is his best case scenario, is it? This is
Yeah,
him talking. God knows what it'd be like if other people would talk.
exactly. This is someone who decided that his work, l'état c'est moi. His work is himself. And so Sonny Boy is really, it is about Sonny Boy.
Did
It
he
is
have a
not
mother
about,
who had idolized him? Do we have any psychological roots for this?
well, it's his grandmother who called him Sonny Boy. So it was his
There's
grandparents.
always a grandmother or a mother behind these
Yes,
fake
exactly. Same thing
guy.
with Bruce Springsteen.
Who?
Bruce Springsteen in his memoir,
Yeah, yeah. Although I think Bruce
I'm
Springsteen at
not
least probably
trying to say they're
tries
the
to have a little
same.
bit more humility, for better or worse, than Pacino. The other bit I read, and we could spend a whole show on this, was
Yes, we could.
Pacino's story of meeting Brando on the set of Godfather, and Brando being in a fake hospital, I guess, and eating his chicken dinner with his hands. Is there a Brando quality to Pacino? Does he inherit that Brando insanity or
Swagger.
hyper reality? I don't
Or
know what you would how you would describe it. And
I
again,
like
there
that
should
we're
be an
talking
adjective associated with Brando.
I like that we're talking about hyperreality through all of these books, because we have one more, and
I
we're
know we got
definitely,
two more, and I got
we have 2. Oh my goodness. But anyway, yes, I think Pacino has some of that swagger. And I always think,
yeah.
because of their age and the movies that they were in at the same time, I always think of Al Pacino and Dustin Hoffman, and they couldn't be more different in so many ways. But I also think that there is a certain 1970s swagger to some of these actors, like you said, and it's so American. It's not just Brando
I mean,
inheriting
it's
it.
Nicholson, of course, but De Niro. I mean,
Mhm,
they
mhm.
were all friends. There's going to be lots of books on that. Speaking
It's
of,
like it's the young cowboys, the non-Western cowboys in some way.
yeah, well, speaking of cowboys and Hoffman, that's another subject.
Yes.
Hyperreality. One man who has perhaps created his own hyperreality, you couldn't make up his life, is Bob Woodward. He seems to come
Mhm.
out with a new book every year or two. He's made a fortune on lots of fronts, recently out of Donald Trump. I've always thought he's a little bit of a parody of himself. What's your take on Woodward and this latest book, War?
Well, here's what I will say. There are a couple of things that are indisputable about Bob Woodward. First of all, that he is,
Speaking of the 70s, excuse the interruption. Speaking of the 70s, of course.
speaking of the 70s, of course, he is an icon along with his colleague Carl Bernstein or Bernstein. And I'm really bad at knowing which people prefer Stein and which prefer Steen. So forgive me, Carl Bernstein. Anyway, they are icons, especially because of the Watergate journalism they did that was, of course, made famous in All the King's Men. But Woodward has had his own path in journalism. And here's the other indisputable thing about him. He does his homework, or he has someone do the homework for him. He has a huge note at the beginning of War acknowledging his seemingly tireless personal assistant. And I thought that was really interesting. The notes.
At least he acknowledges her, and I said her. That was probably
that
a
is, and that is correct, of course. And
I
he
hope
also
he behaves. He doesn't seem to have. He seems to be someone who behaves himself around young women, though. Woodward, is he?
Oh yeah, I think so. And he's been married for 4 or 5 decades now. He is not a play around kind of guy. I think he's too busy writing and he's too busy reporting. And what I appreciated about War, I'm not sure of the central thesis because it really seems to be a paean to President Biden, but he does allow the reporting to speak. This is not something where he's in it every second. There's so many players in this book, and it's all properly done through interviews and recordings. He has a long chapter at the beginning that is actually the very, very late transcribed tape of an interview he and Bernstein did in 1989 with a 42-year-old Donald Trump. And let's
Does he
say,
get, though? I mean, is Woodward, though, living in the past? Does he still think he's covering Nixon and Watergate? Does he understand that something in America has profoundly changed and that Trump isn't Nixon, and the kind of stuff that people were, for better or worse, outraged about Nixon? They're just indifferent on Trump.
I do think he understands that to a certain extent. In no way does this long interview that he gets in there, and he does talk a bit about it, it doesn't set out to criminalize Trump. It doesn't set out to give some kind of takedown, like, here's my new Watergate. That's not what it is. It's a portrait. Everything that Trump says in 1989 damns him. Now that they found the tape of this, I guess Woodward had lost it and finally found it a few years ago.
Yeah, but I wonder again, Woodward and Bernstein brought down Nixon, and these kinds of books, there are so many of them. I mean, obviously the Woodward book has a little bit more heft because of him. They're just writing to an echo chamber. No one who votes for Trump reads these kinds of books, do they?
That is correct. Absolutely. And so I did say, I think the book is a little bit of a paean, not pandering. I don't think that Woodward panders in any way, but I think he does want to show that President Biden has handled war in a different way than Trump would have or than Nixon did. I think he wants to show that Biden really wanted to keep American troops, for example, out of Ukraine, and put measures into place. That doesn't mean that you have to agree with it, but it is a book about showing, look at these figures in the center of the cover.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to
Harris.
get into this. Maybe we can talk about it another time. But
Yeah.
my sense is that Trump's going to win the election because of I mean, obviously the two candidates are very close, because of the nonfiction narrative. God, if there is one, is certainly a nonfiction writer, and it's a much more suitable ending, but that's another subject. And also in terms of hyperreality, you mentioned Dustin Hoffman earlier in the context of Al Pacino. Of course, Dustin Hoffman played Woodward in All the President's Men.
Yes.
One of the great films, obviously, about the book and the Nixon scandal.
Yes.
Finally, so there's a lot of hyperreality there. Finally, the final book, which is also kind of hyperreal, comes back to a subject that you and I have talked about many, many times in America, race. The final book in this nonfiction fall summer roundup is Sarah Lewis's The Unseen Truth: When Race Changed Sight in America. What does that mean?
Well, Sarah Lewis is an art historian, among other things, a professor at Harvard who founded the, I hope I get this correct, the Visualization and Justice Initiative. And this is a book about the ways in which photographs, maps, paintings, portrayals, sketches, all of this kind of media has been used in the United States since around the Civil War to change the way we look at other people. And it's the most important book on this list. I'm glad we've left it till last because I do want to underscore how meaningful the unseen truth is. There are so many things I could tell you about this book, but what I want to get to is the idea of maps and how a certain sector of the American elite, having a sort of obsession with Caucasia, which is actually Circassia in Russia, near Russia, that this obsession with Caucasians being a race that led to, quote unquote, white people, and how that changed the maps that we look at and even the globes that we use to educate people, people who we decided would be called different races. We would have this division between black and white because, of course, there was a purer race that came from this Caucasus region. There is no such thing as a white Caucasian. Actually, if you look at people from the Circassian area, they're probably slightly darker, maybe more akin to some of the people who live in northern regions of Canada and Greenland, and it just doesn't exist. And so Lewis is trying to say, we have been hornswoggled. She even talks about P.T. Barnum and the way he would put these women into sort of fright wigs and say they were beautiful Circassian ladies. And it was sort of to other them because these wigs would look like, I guess, what we might call an afro today.
So it's more hyper reality. It's almost
Yes, it is. It's totally more hyper
a
reality.
cartographical hyper reality. Is that what
Yes.
you're writing about?
Yes, but cartographical, and also the way we wound up seeing people who were not quote unquote Americans, that means white Americans, portrayed even in Winslow Homer. You see paintings, Lewis shows us, where there is a narrative of a person with dark skin that is very different than the same narrative might be of a person with lighter
It sounds an
skin.
interesting book. It's published by Harvard University Press,
Yes.
an academic press. Sometimes these books are these academic books,
No, this is,
representation and race are a bit dense.
I could
It's
not put
easy
it
to
down.
read.
I could not put it down. It is so fascinating. It is not a dry academic tome. Yes, there are a few things in it that you might have to stop and think, oh, how do I put A and B together? But it is so readable. It has tons and tons of interesting research in it. It is a book that will change. It's as necessary as Isabel Wilkerson's Cast.
Wow. Well, you put yourself in a hole here because I always end, as you know, in our summaries with a choice of one book, but I'm guessing that this is it. Sarah Lewis is The Unseen Truth, When Race Changed Sight in America. Is this your top nonfiction book for fall 2024?
It is.
Well, we are gonna also do a show on fiction, and I'm not sure whether the fiction books will keep up with the nonfiction, but Bethanne Patrick, as always, huge pleasure, honor. You've done all the legwork on these fascinating 7 nonfiction books. We will see you again in the next few days with a show about fiction in America in 2024. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, let's do the fiction.
Okay, you know what?
I know you got half an hour.
Yeah, just barely. Do
Okay, we'll
you?
do a quick one, yeah?
Okay, we'll do a quick one. All right.
So let's sort of try and keep on it.
Yes.
Okay, so and I'll do a new intro.
Okay, wonderful.
Hold on. Hello, everybody. A few days ago, we did a show with our book critic, Bethanne Patrick, on notable nonfiction books for the fall of 2024. There were some remarkable books, and we're following up, Bethanne, with your top 7 novels. One of the things that strikes me is in our hyper-real age, where nonfiction is almost impossible to believe. You couldn't make a lot of the stories up that we're seeing. Of course, we're looking at them all every evening on our television now in the upcoming election. How does fiction broadly stack up against nonfiction in fall 2024? Are some of the fiction books in an odd way more real than the nonfiction ones?
I do think in some ways they show reality more than the nonfiction ones do. And that is because I believe novelists are taking a very hard look at what's really going on and finding new ways. It doesn't have to be realism in the novel to show something that's real.
So, novelists, of course, have more tools in a sense to
Mhm.
invent and reinvent, and theorize and re theorize. Of these 7 novelists, who are most ambitious in terms of form of the 7 novels
Mm.
that you suggest? Who are, in their own way, as novelists, trying to play around with our sense of reality?
It's really interesting, that you asked that because I have always been quite interested in experimental fiction. That is one of my great loves. And so I think these are actually pretty straightforward novels for the most part, considering how many really different ones there are, but I will say that there are different perspectives. And so I can tell you we've got a book that has a structure that mirrors a journey. We've got a book that actually is so autobiographical yet completely fictive that you
Is that the
wonder.
Hollingworth book?
No, no, it's the Greenwell. Uh, and then we've also
And
got
the Greenwell book is called Small
Small
Rain.
Rain.
I'm always nervous of a novel with the word small in it, and sometimes novels are a bit small. Is this not a small book? The
Oh,
guy.
it's not a small book, no. I will go to the mat with anyone about Garth Greenwell. He is a genius. His first novel, What Belongs to You, was well, it was one sentence, but that doesn't even matter. It doesn't even matter that he managed to write an entire novel, in one sentence. What matters is that it was a straight on, no holds barred look at what desire is for a gay man, what sex is for a gay man, and not trying to pretend and put it behind euphemisms or closed doors, and also not trying to pretend that it's all pretty and sanitized. It was absolutely groundbreaking. And I think Small Rain is absolutely groundbreaking as well, because this is the story of something that really happened to Greenwell. He had, and I'm not going to get the medical term right, he had a terrible aortic tear. And the artery, I thought this would be something heart related, but it's something that happened in his abdomen. And evidently, it's so incredibly painful. It's beyond painful. And so the protagonist of Small Rain is a poet who is in the hospital having suffered this terrible medical anomaly. It doesn't usually happen to someone so young. And the book is about pain and weakness and frailty and sickness and how awful it is to be dependent on, you know, a medical system, but it's also about being cared for by a lover, by a partner, by someone who truly, truly wants you to get better. It's about getting better for something, for a future. And it is all, I can't say it's all true because he did write it as a novel, but it is all authentic.
Yeah, and it's these novelists in comparison with the nonfiction writers, their version of reality is much neater, more packaged. Another of the writers is Alan
Yes.
Hollinghurst, Our Evenings. Tell us about this book.
Well, this book, Hollinghurst deserves a much wider readership in the United States. He wrote The Swimming Pool Library, The Line of Beauty.
Yeah, and I don't want to, I because I'm following on from him. The Swimming Pool, of course, is also a book about a gay take, I guess,
Yes.
in some ways on reality. If
Well, this one
the right
is
way of
too,
putting
but hear me out, Andrew, hear me out. Alan Hollinghurst is a chronicler of queer life, just as Garth Greenwell is, but their style is utterly different. And this story has, again, I don't spoil endings, it has the most meaningful ending that I never, ever would have seen coming. It is a story about a British Burmese man and his way through life and his lovers and his partner. Really gorgeous. The story is incredible. But then when you get to the last chapter, you will see,
if you get to the last chapter.
if you get to but there's no reason why you shouldn't, because it is a great book. It's a beautiful story, and it's not about, you know, gay life as gay life. It's about gay life as human life. It's beautiful. Everyone loves it, and I guarantee anyone out there who's interested, Our Evenings, Alan Hollinghurst, fantastic read, should go on your list.
Is it going to be a bestseller? One of the books that on the list, I think, is almost a guaranteed bestseller. Paula Hawkins' The Blue Hour. I have to admit, I was a little surprised to see this come up on your list. You tend to be a literary fiction reader. Why did you choose to include The Blue Hour? Maybe I'm being unfair on Hawkins.
No, you're not being unfair. I mean, you're right. I tend to lean toward literary fiction. I like fiction that is a little, you know, heavier and more meaningful. First of all, Paula Hawkins is a kick-ass writer. And second, this book really surprised me. And I'm surprised I haven't seen more people talking about it. This is not another Girl on the Train. This is different. And it's not really, it's suspenseful. There are deaths, but it is not about murder or thrills and chills. It's about a very twisted relationship. It's highly psychological. It has great atmosphere. It's set on a little island. It
In
is
Scotland, yeah. I mean,
in
it sounds
Scotland.
very cinematic. It sounds
It
as if
is very
it's almost a
cinematic, but
screenplay.
it's not superficial. It was, I read it and thought, oh gosh, this is going to be all over the place. And I don't know. I haven't seen
Well,
it
it
all.
will be all over the place. Wherever if you're in the airport, you will see it on the front stand. Some of the
I
other
hope
books
so.
won't. One of the things that always interests me about fiction are titles. I don't know if
Mhm.
they sell or not, but the most curious title of your fiction books recommended for fall this year, Bethanne, is by Anna Montague. How does that make you feel, Magda Eklund? Before we get to the book itself, do you think titles matter? I have to admit that the longer the title, the more off-putting it could become.
You know, I really wondered about this title as well, and I'll tell you something. There have been a lot of books in the past few years with these, I don't know what you call them, these eccentric women's names, you know,
It almost sounds like another. I mean, not that I'm such a maven on fiction, but it sounds like another book that you see in airports or something.
it does. And I thought, oh, this is one of those, you know, books where you find out the protagonist is I don't know, a high functioning autistic person, or they're a lifelong hoarder who just needs a great love to change things for them. It's not. It's a much more layered book. This is the one I mentioned where the structure mimics the journey. So Magda Eklund is a psychiatrist in Manhattan, and she has a lifelong friend, and the woman dies, and her husband, her widower, the woman's widower, says, will you take these ashes? I just can't deal with them in the apartment right now. And so she winds up taking the urn. If you look at the cover, you'll see that there's an urn, a cremains urn buckled in the seat next to Magda. And they go on this road trip, this highly unlikely and incredibly foreshortened.
They don't go into, they're not going to Trump territory, do they?
No, they are not. They are not. They are going into Magda's inner life territory. I found it surprising. It goes back and forth, and that's what I mean about the road trip. You think you're going in one direction, and then suddenly things turn in another direction and another. But it's really life affirming, not heartwarming, life affirming. And
Probably, yeah, they could have come up with a better title, you're suggesting.
they could have come up with a better title, but I do recommend this very, very much. I was really struck by it when I read it, and it stayed with me. That was 3 or 4 months ago. It stayed with me.
Another book that you're recommending is Creation Lake by Rachel Kushner. This one sounds interesting. Certainly escaping Manhattan and psychology, going back
Completely.
to Europe. It sounds like a good story.
It's a great story. So Rachel Kushner is, highly acclaimed for books like The Flamethrowers. She talk about doing her homework. This is a scenario, I don't even know how she cooked it up, but basically Sadie Smith is this 30-something woman who is a secret agent, and she gets sent to look into this crazy anarchic radical group in France who are all about going back to living on the land. What I loved about it is it's an espionage novel wrapped in an eco thriller, wrapped in an identity search, and there's going to be, an older man, there's going to be a younger man, there's going to be Sadie wondering what she's gotten herself into. It's so great. I mean, again, talk about a book I can't put down. I could not.
Yeah, you couldn't make. I mean, it kind of reminds me in our nonfiction roundup from a few days ago. You talked about Abbott Taylor's Eden Undone, but this sounds like a kind of a fictional version of that.
It really is, because you have all of the characters, you have all of the strange action, you have people, you don't know what their motivation is, you don't really understand everyone's interiority. I think Kushner has hit it out of the park again with Creation Lake.
And is this more on the popular Paula Hawkins model of, is this the kind of book that will sell tens of thousands rather than a few thousand?
That's interesting. I mean, Kushner does sell a lot. I don't know.
What does selling a lot mean for fiction?
Selling a lot for fiction, I think, means, well, for mid-list is one thing, but for books like this by Hawkins and Kushner, I think we're talking, 50,000.
I mean, they get significant, and perhaps in contrast with some of the other authors, they probably get considerable advances for these.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, we won't get into this, but I don't know if advances are always deserved, but I do know that these two writers are going to earn out their advances.
Well, we know that advances often aren't deserved, and I don't actually think they benefit the publishing industry. That's another subject.
Yes.
One book that I'm guessing probably didn't get a Kushner-Hawkins style advance is Rental House, and I'm gonna do a terrible job, I'm sure, with pronouncing the name of the author. Weike Wang, Weike Wang. Tell us about this book.
I believe it's Waika Wang, but I'm not sure
Waika
either.
Wang,
That's
anyway.
okay. So this one, I don't think I've talked about it on here before, but I believe I've had it in the LA Times before. It's a December book, and December can be a real, you know, tough time for publishers. There's not a lot of new releases coming out in December. This is a great one. Waika Wang wrote Jane is Okay. I'm trying to remember one of her other titles. It'll come to me. I love Rental House. It's sort of in two parts. So a young couple who live in Brooklyn go first to
Is
Cape
this the
Cod.
first novel written about a young couple in Brooklyn?
I know it's not, no, but they are a couple who is Asian American and white.
Another first.
Another first, but wait, they go to a rental house on Cape Cod with her parents, who are, I believe she's first gen. Her parents have come to the United States from China, and it's really uncomfortable. Nothing is right for the parents. The couple doesn't get any, joy out of this. It's just, oh, this rental
Very
house is,
intergenerational
it
and
is, yes.
Asian American.
But then in the second half, it's years later, and they go, here's another one you won't see coming. They go to a house in the Catskills. And they go to a cabin, a little community, in the Catskills, very hipster, and they have their own little house. And this is when his family comes in. And at first you think, oh, they're having a lot more fun. Things are going better. It's easier. But you see that the problems are on both sides. The problems aren't about race. The problems are about family. It is really tough to share a rental house with family. And it's done with such grace and humor. It's really one of the loveliest books of 2024. And I just keep talking about it because I think Wang has actually given us truth instead of hyper reality. So even though the
So
hyper,
fiction does a better job, as we
yeah,
talked in our
as we said,
nonfiction
yeah,
section. In a way, fiction writers have a better opportunity to describe what we consider truth or what we think about as truth, perhaps to package it up. So maybe the publishers made a mistake scheduling it for December. Do they tend to write books off? Do you think that they publish in
I hope
December?
not. I hope not. I
Well,
hope
you haven't. And by the way, Bethanne, we should mention to all our viewers and listeners that you yourself have a new podcast out. So
thank
everyone should
you.
listen. A brief blurb about that.
I will give you a very brief blurb. The Book Maven, a literary review, is out now. Please subscribe on Substack because eventually we're going to have all kinds of goodies there for subscribers. We just released episode 3 on October 11th, and we've got 10 episodes in season 1. In season 2, we're going to have interviews with some great people, including Min Jin Lee. So I'm very excited about
I'm sure
that.
it's much more curated and thought out, less spontaneous than Keen On.
It it is, and only because we keep it at 30 minutes and we have different features. It really is sort of like a variety show. So far, I'm hearing good things. I'm having a great time with it, and I hope listeners will have a great time with it
Well,
too. So
Bethanne, I know
thanks.
that's your polite way of reminding me that you got to go out for dinner in about
I
4
do.
minutes. So let's get to the final,
Yeah.
your final suggested novel. Actually has the best title, or not the best title, sorry, the best cover. And again, I think covers on novels are way more important than on nonfiction. Shred Sisters by Betsy Lerner. Tell us about this, and tell us about, do you like this cover? I mean, people just watching, people just listening won't see this cover, but it's really a
No, I
spectacular
really
cover.
like this cover. I like the palette. I like the separation between the sisters. And, Betsy Lerner was an editor who turned literary agent. She's written some great
Yeah,
craft
she
books.
has a story. There was a Times piece about her
Mhm.
as a TikTok star, and now she's added novelist to her resume. So there's perhaps a hyper real quality to her own career.
There is, and I am all for it. I want to say go, Betsy, go, because this book is so good. Talk about readable. You just dive right into it. And there are two sisters, Amy and Olivia, Ollie, and you are in their world in the 1960s and 1970s as they're growing up, then in the 1980s and 1990s and early 2000s as Ollie is falling apart with mental illness and Amy is trying to construct a life that isn't all about taking care of her sister for, her parents when they're alive and when they're not. I was really, again, surprised by the end of this book, but it's very satisfying and it's well earned. And Betsy Lerner is proving that she is a great, great novelist. I cannot wait to read her next book. And I think this one was one that came from a very real place in her own life. And yet she's managed to, create fiction again that is real, not hyper real, and it is definitely something I recommend for perhaps before Thanksgiving.
Yeah,
Not
maybe
really.
in contrast to some novels that always seem to come out of creating writing school, she has had a life as a
Yes.
literary agent, as a TikTok star, very unusual woman. Maybe that comes out in her fiction.
It does. This is no MFA novel. This is a fully realized novel that it gets it all right all the way through. So, Shred Sisters, definitely go out and get that now. But all of these, get them all.
Yeah, there's no FMA novels in this list. Finally, Bethanne, my unfair question at the end. You got one novel to read in the fall. Which one would it be?
Oh, just one of these.
Yeah,
Oh
you
my
can have
goodness.
one. You go to a desert island, you just take one of these books with you.
This is very, very tough. Okay, I am going to think hard. I'm going to say The Hollinghurst.
Wow, why?
Um, Again, because of its really beautiful portrayal of a life, but also its extra layer of meaning at the end that is highly relevant, but it's not overblown and it's not overdone.
It has then perhaps sometimes people pigeonhole novelists and novels. It has a universal quality, even if he's well known, Alan Hollinghurst, as a writer about gay life.
Yes, it absolutely does. This is not a novel. It's not that it's not challenging, it's that it is so welcoming.
Well, I'm going to ask an even more unfair question. You chose Sarah Lewis's Unseen Truth as your best nonfiction book of the fall. If you had to choose one of these, the Hollinghurst or the Lewis, to take on a journey, which one would it be?
I would choose the Lewis.
Well, Bethanne Patrick, you're always dealing with my unfair questions in a very fair way. Honored to have you on the show. I know you've
Thank
got to rush
you.
off for a dinner in Washington, D.C. We will see you certainly by the end of the year to talk more books, literature.
Definitely.
It's always an honor. Thank you so much.
Thanks.